We're here to discuss whether quality newspapers have a future or not in Australia, but also it's obviously a question that goes much beyond that. It seems to me that this is a very suitable time to discuss this topic. It's partly a suitable time because of the problems that have befallen the Murdoch newspapers in Britain and the Leveson inquiry then. It's partly a suitable time because we've just had the Finkelstein inquiry into the Australian media, ethics of media in Australia. It's also, it seems to me, an interesting time because one of the richest women in the world, Gina Rinehart, has just bought a stake in Fairfax. But I think by far the most important issue is the question of whether or not something that is a very traditional institution of Western democracies, the newspaper, will or will not survive in printed form. And of course the question then is, if it doesn't survive in printed form, whether our democracy will be shifted in serious ways, whether we can do without that kind of really serious journalism within a culture of the sort we're familiar with. And I think what I'd like to say is just two things before I introduce Eric and Mary, and maybe Paul in absentia. Still in absentia. One is that we have two sort of models about what happens with technology and the shift in things. It was often thought that television would replace radio and that in turn the internet would replace television. And that simply hasn't happened. What you've had is an accumulation of technologies which don't make earlier ones redundant, but they just shift emphasis. On the other hand, apart from a recent winner of the Oscars, in general silent films did not survive talking films, or the horse and buggy didn't survive the coming of the motor car. So there are occasions in culture where things that are thought to be replacing other things don't do so, and occasions when new technology replaces something old. So if I can just quickly introduce Eric Beecher was, I think the youngest person ever to edit a major Australian newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald, 200 years ago. Was editor-in-chief of Herald and Weekly Times under Rupert Murdoch in the 80s, and indeed he gave me a job as a columnist many years ago. He's more recently created Text Media and then left it, but was the creator of it, and he's now the proprietor of Crikey. He also, it seems to me, to be one of the shrewdest minds concerning media in this country, and I'm very pleased. I just discovered a few minutes ago that he also had a son who studied at La Trobe, which I was pleased to learn. Mary de Brett, who's one of the panellists, teaches in media and journalism at this university. She has a background mainly in television, but a contemporary interest in public affairs television and broadcasting, and also is working at the moment on the adequacy of the reporting of climate change in the media in Australia. I think just Australia. So anyhow, without further ado, Eric, if you could talk to us about your views on future of quality newspapers.
Thanks, Rob. I'd like to start by just making a sort of differentiating point between quality newspapers and quality journalism, because they aren't necessarily obviously the same thing. And the challenges to the future of the newspaper, and in particular the quality newspaper, is actually to do with its business model. It's a commercial challenge, and as a byproduct of that, quality journalism in the commercial sphere, most of which is the result of journalism in quality newspapers, but not all of it, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is under enormous pressure because the funding for that journalism is obviously related to the commercial challenges that affect newspapers. So I think it's important to just look at the, if you like, the sort of economic organism of the newspaper, particularly the kind of newspaper we're talking about. And the kind of newspaper we're talking about in this country are loosely what we would call broadsheet newspapers like The Age or The Australian or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Financial Review, and really, in my mind, those four constitute most of the universe of quality newspapers in this country. And that's not unusual. In most other countries there's a relatively small number of high quality newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian or the London Telegraph and that kind of thing. And the vast bulk of newspaper circulation and newspaper readers are not part of the universe of quality newspapers. They're part of the universe of what we'd loosely call popular newspapers, and they have a different business model, and in my view they therefore have a different challenge, and it's a challenge in its own right, but it's not anywhere near as I think as serious as the challenge to the quality newspapers. And so the business mechanism of a quality newspaper like The Age or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Australian is that it actually has almost nothing to do with how many newspapers they sell or how much they sell those newspapers for. The major portion of the revenue and virtually all the profit from those kinds of newspapers comes from the advertising revenue. So they are in the business of aggregating the right kind of readers on behalf of advertisers, and advertisers want to reach those readers, and in the case of quality newspapers those readers are usually regarded as being in the sort of upper demographic of society, and they're quite desirable. It's quite a desirable audience, and advertisers traditionally have paid premium advertising rates. But newspapers like that, obviously they have to have a circulation, and it has to be the right kind of circulation and the right kind of audience. So that's important, but it's important in a commercial sense so that they can attract enough advertising revenue to fund and make a profit out of their business. And that's where the challenge to quality newspapers now resides, that the advertising that provided the windfall profits for these newspapers over a large part, certainly the second half of the last century, and made them, the term that's used is rivers of gold, made them immensely profitable newspapers that had virtual monopolies of that audience. Those revenues are disappearing. And in fact, I brought a little chart along just to highlight this, if you can see it. This was produced last week in the United States, and this graph starts in 1950 down here, bottom left, and ends in 2010 in the bottom right, and that is the advertising revenue in adjusted dollar terms in American newspapers between 1950 and 2010, and it started at $20 billion. That's all daily newspapers in America, and it's now back to $20 billion, and at its peak it was over $60 billion, and that was as recently as 2000 or after 2000. And so what that graph shows you is the money that funds quality journalism, in this case in America, but my view would be that the trend is global. And it's a devastating graph, and it's, I mean, for people like Paul and I who love newspapers and believe passionately in quality journalism, it's a devastating graph. And that's really at the heart of the problem. It's not about do people want quality journalism, is quality journalism important to society, any of those issues. There's no question about that. In fact, the audience for it has grown. The problem is the money that pays for it, and it is very expensive, comes primarily from advertising revenue, virtually all of it in fact from advertising revenue, and that has left newspapers at an alarming rate. And so the challenge for quality newspapers in the context of producing quality journalism, running hundreds of journalists, foreign bureaus, big Canberra bureaus, proper business staff, investigative journalism, public interest journalism across all the specialties like education and science and health. It's expensive, it's really expensive. And that used to be paid until the beginning of this century by the advertising, which often had not very much to do with the content of that journalism, but there was a kind of tacit understanding between the advertisers and the publishers and the editors and the journalists that the big ads, the classified pages of ads, or the ads for big department stores or whatever it was that were targeted at the audience that quality newspapers delivered for them, they knew and they understood and they were probably quite happy about the fact that decent chunks of the money they spent on those ads was deployed to produce quality journalism, and so the system worked. I guess my argument is that quality journalism now, separate from quality newspapers but intertwined with quality newspapers because they are the primary funder of quality journalism in the commercial sphere outside the ABC, in this country outside the ABC and SBS and national broadcasting, that the pressure on the funding source of that journalism is acute, it is disastrous, and the concern I think that we all have is what's going to fund that journalism if the advertising that traditionally funded it has disappeared or is disappearing. And there have been lots of discussions. It's a subject of intense, almost frenzied discussion now in journalism schools, in all sorts of places where the importance of public interest journalism and the public discourse in the broadest sense takes place. What is going to fund investigative journalism? What is going to fund foreign coverage and political journalism if the advertising in big quality newspapers that used to fund it has actually left those newspapers? And no one has an answer yet. Everybody is grappling with that. But I would end by saying that I think if there is no answer, and I think ultimately there will be an answer, but the answer might be a different kind of answer. It might include some government funding and philanthropic funding, and that kind of journalism might become much more niche because it will become much more expensive for consumers to pay for, because they'll be forced to pay a much bigger price for it because the advertisers no longer subsidise it. So, you know, everyone hopes that there will be some kind of calibration to support it. But in the meantime, because there is no answer now, and most newspaper publishing companies, certainly in this country and elsewhere, are publicly listed companies who are answerable to their shareholders and to their share price and to their quarterly earnings, and so they are under enormous pressure to deliver bottom line results, and as a result of that, the resources for quality journalism are being whittled away at the moment. There's still enough there. I would argue the quality of journalism in this country is as high as it's been ever, and that's a relative judgment, and you know it's very subjective. But if the trend on that graph I showed you continues, and if it's replicated here in Australia, and it's not quite as acute as that, but it is happening here, then there's no doubt that a publicly listed newspaper publishing company can no longer invest in journalism in the way it did before. That's just an economic fact of life. So the desperate hope is that a mechanism will be found to fund commercial quality journalism of the kind that we're used to in broadsheet newspapers, because if it doesn't, I think society, as well as people studying journalism, will be the losers.
I'm extremely pleased that Paul has arrived, and very grateful that he's come to the university. Doesn't need much introduction. Paul, I think, has been at the Age since 1996, a very seasoned journalist. He's now editor-in-chief of the Age, which is one of the most important and responsible positions in both Melbourne Victorian society. So thanks, Paul, very much for coming here. Questions about newspapers? Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Rob, and it really is a pleasure to be here. I'm very sorry I did run a little bit late today. I had one of those taxi drivers who wasn't quite sure about the streets of Melbourne, and particularly the streets of Bundoora, even though I enjoyed my conversation with him. But I also ran late for another reason. I was in really the thick of a discussion in the office. Will we publish an investigation that we've been working on for weeks? Will we publish tomorrow? Or will we publish later in the week? What are the unanswered questions? How well have we covered off what I saw as the critical issues within the pieces? And then I've been in conferences this morning. How serious is this situation in China where they've pegged back their growth forecasts? Is it true that they sneeze and we catch a cold? How should we investigate this? Or is it just a kite and don't worry about it? If Bob Carr's the new Foreign Minister of Australia, what are the issues that create exposure for him? What was the dirtiest bit of laundry that he was working on when he was a lobbyist? And to what extent does that put him in conflict with his new government, which he's now a member of and a leading member of? I was busy asking questions. And every day, just so you know, in a similar way to what you do at university, in tutorials, particularly in debates with senior lecturers, particularly if you're doing postgraduate work, every day when you ask questions is what we try to engender in a team at the Age. And it's trite, I know, but we set out to do this in terms of the public interest. I'd like to give, as a precursor to what I'm sure will be some very good questions, I'd like to give a mixture of professional and personal to you in a short address. On the professional, I must say I think Eric's given a very good summary. The business model for newspapers, quality independent newspapers in Australia, is being seriously challenged. This thing called the internet, not only has it arrived, but it's arrived with enough force that it's stealing all of your time. Screens dominate. And in this mishmash of lost time and lost thoughts, somehow, and I might say some days I wake and I think somehow more miraculously than I ever thought newspapers used to be, it used to be that the miracle of newspapers was that we just produced another million words off a printing plant and on trucks and delivered by 6:30. Now I think the miracle is that we produce original thoughts, original context in a world of churning 24/7 opinion and debate. And in that sense, it gets harder. But if I reflect on 18 months in the chair at the Age, 18 months of covering Melbourne, the nation and the world, it's been extraordinary. One of our reporters covering the uprisings in Egypt was kidnapped, blindfolded and taken into custody. Fortunately, we were able to get him out. Being a newspaper man and a newspaper editor, when the Japan earthquake happened and the nuclear risk, I had John Garneau on a plane in a flash to Tokyo. Shortly thereafter, I had my knuckles rapped for, perhaps inadvertently and in my rush, not considering the nuclear fallout issue for a member of staff. But he covered Tokyo with distinction. If I think about just the past week with Rudd and Gillard, and in a 24/7 news crush, what are the unanswered questions? How can you bring value to it in the newspaper? What does a quality independent newspaper do? I think we did okay on a quite complex, rapidly moving story with truths and half-truths, shadows and mysteries. And the world of being a journalist is really, really changing. Fundamentally, quickly, and for all time, I think. Our journalists now, whereas they used to just write for the paper, are writing for their online site. They're writing for specialist online sites, sometimes politics, sometimes broad opinion. They appear to camera in a TV studio on the main newsroom floor of The Age. They do what our hosts today do, sometimes with the Prime Minister, at Media House in the city. They blog, they tweet. Catherine Murphy, covering the Rudd-Gillard contest, did a live blog that attracted 800,000 followers. It's a bit like when you see Latika Burke, if you see her on Twitter and have a look at the followers. Is it any wonder that Kevin Rudd actually has 1 million followers on Twitter? This is our world, and as the world changes, journalism has changed. And this brings into sharp relief what is quality journalism. When we say, will there still be quality newspapers in Australia in the future, it starts with what is quality. And one of the things that's happening is, a lot of journalists like to reflect on those good old days. Amazing. We stayed back till 3 a.m. Prime Minister was still on the phone till 1. We got the exclusive angle on something. Reader response was fantastic. Did you see the letters to the editor? Those days are moving and shifting rapidly and almost not there anymore. Now it's a matter of, how does the day start on websites? What is it that's available on your smartphones? How do we inform our readers in the middle of the day? How do we inform them in the middle of the afternoon? What are they seeking by dinner time? And what is it about evenings that has seen iPad usage go through the roof? Can I just ask in this room, who has an iPad? How many people use their iPad a lot at night? How many people take their iPad to bed? What are you doing with your iPad? Is it long-form journalism, or is it videos, or is it both? For me, it's both. I'm looking for videos, and I want rich, contextual things I can learn videos, and long-form journalism really appeals because it's the time of day when I can really think about it. What's the most valuable thing you get in any given day in your life? And I'm assuming you've got smartphones, some of you have also got iPads, some of you read the papers, etc., etc., etc. But what's the single most important thing you get in your day? I'll go first. It's usually an email attachment. It comes from somebody, a professional contact or a friend, out of the blue. It's serendipitous, it's a surprise. And this trusted source says, this is a really good piece, or this video is really worth watching. And it becomes, for my day, in a sea of information, one of the very best things that I got, one of the very best things that I did. Sometimes for me, of course, in the lucky position of those things containing some pretty rich information. Some personal reflections. I want to talk about romanticism and realities. I want to talk about parenthetical clauses, whiches and that's, and the world according to Fowler's. And I'd like to talk about words, images, and states of mind. At my home, I have white door jambs, and they're ink smudged. I have a tucked away pile of famous newspapers in a cupboard. I have a collection of books on newspaper journalism that would rival most. And I have books that deal with aspects of newspapers, like letters to the editor in the Times of London. And some nights, as editor of The Age, I finish late. Not as late as those glory days, but late enough to find it hard to get a taxi home. And I've been known, sometimes in the pouring rain, to get the last tram home. And I'm still racing with frenetic activity. Rewriting on the news desk, a late angle on the story, the late phone call, finessing the design, chasing the clock. And on such nights, when politicians or power brokers have been working my ear, I am a caricature from one of my books. The exacting editor, the dreamer of ink and ideas, the wizard of words, the teller of truths. And it feels good. Direct a $50 million plus newsroom, put the hard questions, go beyond the obvious, explain what things mean, how people are affected, and uncover wrongdoings. My word, there's a society to protect. But romanticism meets reality every day. I notice that I am the only one on a packed number 19 tram the next morning with newspapers tucked under my arm. Broadsheets too, how dare I? How I delight in pulling those papers out. I scan read for nuances, freshness, insight, surprises and originality. But no one notices. A skyscraper could fall over and no one would notice. It's morning screen time on the tram. Another day of screens, small and big, portable and fixed, is underway. Technology is marching relentlessly, numbingly, impersonally. And it is stealing time. And it's in this context where it seems awkwardly anachronistic to even mention Fowler's. My first editor's copy of Fowler's Modern English Usage sat dead centre on an old oak desk, alongside the Oxford, the Webster's and the Macquarie, a latecomer. For would-be journalists, words and grammar, structure and style, spelling and syntax were everything. Alliteration and rhyme, cadence and control followed. Words really mattered. Words on a page. Simple yet sentinel-like. Phrases and rules from Fowler's were thrown at us. Stories were rigidly reworked. But the times have changed. Education has changed. Words have changed. Colloquialisms are mainstream. Formal is passé. Grammar is found in graveyards. Journalism is beyond Fowler's, beyond tradition. The new pulse does not require a heart. We are now fast, non-fussy, full of self-expression, giddy with text grabs. A parenthetical clause belongs to a bracket of time. Now information is a state of mind. How we learn is a state of mind. News of choice is everywhere, 24/7. We click into a hedonistic haze of headlines. Newspapers are quaint. Newspapers actually take time, and that means putting the screens away, stopping, thinking, relaxing, reflecting, serendipitously learning. On weekdays, in my view, this is hard. The screens scream at you if they are left alone for too long. And the world that is free oozes temptations. Newspapers are friends, but not everyone has time, even for a friendship. On weekends, newspapers have a chance. Community elders lead the way, and Generation Screen stirs. Tired of closed circle clatter and chatter, tired of moment-by-moment updates, tired of going to bed with screens, tired of being tired. Over coffees, under trees, under cereal bowls across the city, romanticism re-emerges, just for a day or two, just while the screens recharge. And just long enough to remind everyone that words on paper, lots of words on paper, thoughtful words, clever words, worked over words, can really matter if we care. if we find time, if we value ideas, and ultimately, in the crisis of modern journalism and serious quality newspapers, if we pay. Thank you.
I think we've been privileged to hear two extremely intelligent and two very different accounts of a response to this question. And I'd love to know if somehow we can find a way of reconciling Paul's idealism about the printed word and the newspaper and Eric's realism about the commercial problems that a newspaper lover like Paul, like Eric, feels and fears for the future of newspapers. What we're now going to do is have some questions, and we'll all be able to be seated. I've got quite a lot of questions I'd like to ask about this, and then some of the more contemporary questions facing Australian newspapers and media. But if I could ask Mary to begin us.
Yes, I just want to pick up on, you both said the public interest journalism is obviously very important today, and there are, because of the funding crisis, obviously threats to the ability of media organisations to produce public interest journalism. And I just had a question relating to that, really. Public opinion polling of public attitudes to climate change have signalled declining public preparedness to pay for the cost of action on climate change. So it seems to me that public communication on the topic of climate change is really not cutting through. And it would seem to me that's a really important role for public interest journalism. And I wondered if you could, both of you, perhaps share your thoughts on why that's not happening, why we have that disconnect between the reality and public opinion.
I think that's a very good question. In some of the discussions I have, I think some leading politicians recognise the failure of narrative at a federal level. I think one of the great challenges, first of all, of the public position for governments is, if you believe in something, if you're putting the policy, then you also have to take responsibility for the public narrative and the force of that narrative. And leadership really is about influencing others towards those outcomes. And there is a question mark, I think, about if our current government believes this passionately to be the issue that it says it is, where is the constant reinforcement, where is the explanation, etc. And I see the Age's role as holding the government accountable in and around that level of kind of disclosure on their narrative. For the paper itself, and it should be recognised, there has been a divisive national debate on this issue and a division within mainstream media on this issue as well. I unashamedly explain to you that the Age has taken the view that climate change is something that deserves investment, deeper understanding, and to that extent all of the economic modelling on outcomes if carbon price or trading schemes are put in place. We have advocated that based on, so we've been a paper that's been closer to the international scientific evidence in and around climate change. Other media organisations, in part written up by Robert and others, have not taken that view, and in some measure have really exploded the divisiveness of the political debate by campaigning for the opposite. And the opposite is, I think, a protectionist view in and around industry, offshoring risks, and the right of entrepreneurs to control all of their cost inputs, if that's the right phrase. Summary for me on this issue is, I did a rolling analysis of the Age's coverage of climate change in about the middle of last year, concerned that in some measure maybe we, in opinion, in reporting and everything, that there were suggestions we'd been a bit hard one way, that we'd been a bit too pro climate change. And I didn't really find that we had, but what I did do was I broadened the voices in the paper as a result of what I'd looked at, and I ensured that there were other voices published and debated and listened to within the pages of the Age. It's always a very difficult thing, this, and it's impossible to strive for 100% balance. But I think the idea of the church of ideas is to ensure that everything gets an airing over time. The Age sees this as one of the big issues of our time. We're prosecuting it, we're staying on it. We're one of the few organisations with an environment editor, an environment reporter, a senior writer with a brief to cover the scientific aspects of it, another person in Canberra with a brief to cover it, and a desire, a passion to invite external voices across the breadth of the debate. So we feel we're doing okay. My biggest point is we see our role as trying to hold the power brokers to account to really explain what the national narratives are.
I mean, I think it is a fascinating subject for study, particularly in the context of the way the media has covered it, and I agree with Paul, the way that the politicians have framed it. Because you have a situation here where it's incredibly polarised, obviously, but it's all built on scientific interpretations, and none of us are scientists, and even if we were a single scientist, there are plenty of other scientists who have a different point of view. So to the extent that the media and the politicians have actually kind of cut through all of that and presented it in a way that depolarised it, if that was possible, they haven't. You know, I mean, to me, it's not a scientific issue because it's a risk issue. So all you have to establish is there a big enough risk? Is there a 10 or 15% risk that climate change is real? And I think the body of evidence, even Andrew Bolt would probably concede there's a 10 or 15% risk. He would argue it's that low. My argument would be if there's a 10 or 15% risk of anything threatening the planet, if there's a 10 or 15% risk of Australia being invaded by another country, we would take all the precautionary steps we would need to take, even though there was by definition, an 80% risk it wasn't going to happen because the consequences were so high. It's never framed like that. It gets back down to scientific interpretation, and you can never win with that. But that's more a personal view.
May I just come in there? I think, Eric, that's a really sharp kind of way to frame the debate about that 10 to 15% risk. If you do take another example like bioterrorism or international terrorism per se, a 10 to 15% risk sees a lot of activity, a hell of a lot of activity.
Well, look at the defence budget. Why do we have a defence budget?
Yep.
For a risk that's probably lower than that.
Yeah.
Can I slightly disagree? I mean, it's not really the time to do this, but I just want to slightly disagree with Eric. It seems to me, and this is based on surveys made amongst climate scientists, that the overwhelming majority agree with the following proposition, that by burning fossil fuels, you are increasing the temperature of the Earth. 97% agree with that. There's lots of disagreement about the rate of change and so on, but it seems to me that it's one of the areas where those within the discipline and I've read many of the scientists talking about this, the overwhelming majority agree that climate change is happening. So the figure of 10 or 15% about it happening would be rejected as far too
I'm saying
too
that's
low.
the minimum level of risk.
Yeah, but I think most scientists would think there is a risk. Where they would disagree is how catastrophic or how calamitous that risk is, and there's huge amount of disagreement. Anyhow, that's. Can I go back to the if we sort of take it in turns, Mary, if I can ask my question. It seems to me that there's a lot of agreement, even though the perspectives that Paul and Eric have given are rather different. And if I can say, the agreement seems to me to be this, that with print newspapers, the revenue that sustains quality journalism is lowering and to some extent plummeting, as in the graph that Eric showed. On the other hand, it seems to me almost everyone agrees that quality journalism is one of the key ingredients of a vital democracy. The big question is, I suppose, the big question is whether there is a way, and Eric said he didn't think we'd yet worked this out, whether there is a way in which if newspapers, print newspapers do decline, and if, let's say, in 20 or 30 years there are hardly any print newspapers left, whether or not we can find ways in which that vital ingredient of democracy, which is quality journalism, analytical journalism, journalism that holds government to account and reflects what's happening in society, can be as healthy as it was, let's say, after the Second World War for 50 years. So it's a complicated question, but Eric, if I can just ask the question to you maybe, you've thought there is a role, but you didn't spell it out much in the talk, for public investment in quality journalism. But there's a big, whereas we accept the ABC, there's a big resistance in Australia and other English-speaking democracies to the idea of governments investing in anything other than broadcast media. So can I get you to say something about that?
Yeah, as I said when I started, to me the difference between quality newspapers and quality journalism isn't that important, other than quality newspapers' business model has provided the funding. In other words, if quality, I mean, as Paul said, he's got a $50 million newsroom. So that actually is the number.
Yes.
In terms of the Age, and it'd be the same for the Sydney Morning Herald and similar for the Australian and so on. And so $50 million a year times 3 or 4 in commercial journalism, happens to be newspapers and online now, and it may end up just being online if the cost of printing and distributing it gets too high. It's that $50 million that counts. It's not whether it's on newsprint. And that's really the issue. One point to remember in this country, and one of the reasons that there has been, you know, not that it's ever got on the agenda in any major way, the concept of government funding of commercial quality journalism, is that the budget of ABC News and Current Affairs is about $160 million a year. And I know that because I sat next to Kate Tawney the other night at the event that we were at, and she told me. And she runs it. So $160 million for the ABC, which is basically 3 ages, you know, and a lot of people, I would certainly argue, I think the Age does a terrific job. They can't drill down city by city in the way that a paper like the Age or the Sydney Morning Herald does, and there's lots of other things they don't do, and that 160 million, a lot of that is quite superficial because it's physical stuff, and it's sets and it's makeup, and, you know, things that you don't have to worry about. But nevertheless, it's a substantial investment, and it's part of $1 billion a year that the government puts into the ABC, and a bit more than that for it, and SBS is on top of that. So in the scheme of things, it's not that much money. I guess what Paul and his colleagues and commercial publishers are trying to do, and indeed in a small way the group that I'm involved in is trying to do, is to find a commercial solution to the problem, charging for content, which we do with Crikey, obviously generating advertising, trying to run other things like events and other revenue streams. And everyone's hoping that might work. I'm dubious that you're going to find 50 million to pay for that if the newspaper advertising disappears, but it's worth trying. If it doesn't work, I can't believe in a country like this, certainly, that the government would allow that kind of journalism to disappear. The problem's going to be there might be quite a bit of erosion before it gets to that point, and then the question is, would they then rebuild it?
Paul, do you?
On the dark side of survival or not, quality journalism for the future, the New York Times has cut costs by something like 35% over the past couple of years. That's journalist jobs, the journalism that they can do, a narrowing of the breadth of their journalism. And I was reading just recently, there's an excellent article out, and they're starting to talk about the size of the newsroom doesn't really reflect the revenues that are going to come from the digital platforms that they have, and they still feel the pressure. Point one. Point two, past week, I think, beginning of last week, Alan Rushbridger, the editor of The Guardian in London, announces a rebranding of The Guardian, and it's a continuation of his philosophy that everything's open and arguably free. And there's a big campaign that's just been launched. Third example, these are all in the past few weeks. The Washington Post over the past few years, or probably decades now, had built a cash cow adjunct to the Washington Post, an education arm to their business, and it's struck some trouble, and as a result the extent of the financial challenge faced by the Washington Post is now fully exposed, and there's a lot of chatter and debate about that. Here in Australia, and at The Age most particularly, we're the beneficiaries of a fairly massive kind of broadening of Fairfax. It's been diversified over the past decade. So this company I work for owns a lot of things now, from regional newspapers to metro papers to on it goes. Partly the hope of the side for Fairfax, and I can't talk for others, is that the diversification away from core journalism will build new revenues of sufficient quantity to pay for the type of journalism we currently have. Do I believe that's possible? I'm part of a team that's putting the strategy together to do that, and it's happening, unfortunately. This is the really catch for us here now. It's happening at a time of not just structural transformation in media, atomisation caused by internet, new sites, the works, vertical, deep niches and everything else. Not only that, but structural change in traditional advertising, a crappy economy with not a two-speed but a patchwork economy causing severe grief to traditional manufacturing, retail, aviation, and on it goes. And as a consequence, you know, this is a cyclical downturn plus a structural shift of proportions we've never had before, and the contagion of Europe and the United States in the shift away from traditional mass media has hit us as well. So the perfect storm is here. The perfect storm is all at once, probably this year and next, I think. These are critical periods, absolutely critical periods. And just a little final bit there, my company has announced that after calling in some people to audit our costs and where we spend our money, they said, well, you spend 70% of your money in areas that aren't related to what you say you're going to do, which is quality journalism, products and sales. And you're spending 70% in other areas. So Fairfax has announced an aggressive cost reduction in the non-core areas of our business, which has to be part of the hope of the side.
Mary?
Just moving off in a slightly different direction, in August 2011, the CEO of the Minerals Council and one of the nation's most powerful lobbyists, Mitch Hook, wrote to members, "The board recognises that over the period of the past 4 years there has been a profound shift in the manner of public policy development and implementation. The new paradigm is one of public contest through the popular media, more so than rational, considered, effective consultation and debate." How should the media respond to this new paradigm of cashed-up lobby groups advancing their interests via the media? And that's a quote from a Monash researcher, Philip Chubb.
Yep.
I was in a, without breaching a confidence, I was, but partially breaching it, I was in a suite that's bigger than normal ministerial suites, and it happened to be in Parliament House in Canberra. And the person in that office said to me, how the hell are we supposed to grapple with an anonymous person who puts something up on Twitter and garners a political following within 24 hours that's big enough to worry us? And this very issue, which is lovely in democracy terms, particularly if it's well thought through and valid, but this is not just a political phenomenon, this is a corporate phenomenon. More and more companies are getting advice on how to use Twitter. More and more companies are getting advice on how to use Facebook. And the media is part of that as well, because we're thinking, well, there's audience reach and growth in there, so we're in there as well. And it's in this churning mass where companies and minerals organisations and others are actually kind of redirecting their whole communication and public affairs campaigns. I am hearing increasingly of public affairs and communications people directing campaigns first through social media, first. So it's just absolutely fascinating.
I mean, it's a trend that's been going on probably at a lower level for several decades, and I don't think either of us have the number, but we know that there's a ratio that's bandied about of the number of PRs and corporate affairs and all those people versus journalists, and it's something like 4 or 5 to 1.
In favour of PRs?
Yeah, and that ratio has been growing dramatically in the past decade. But I think my answer would be, in the context of what we're talking about here, quality journalism, that it in fact applies even more pressure on quality journalism to sift through that. Now, that won't necessarily be consumed by most of the population, but for those who are interested, and that number's increasing, I think, it's even more important to get, to get through the forest.
Right, because the statement sort of indicates that the media is captive to this group, but you dispute that?
Well, when you say the media, I mean that implies...
News media.
Well, the news media, but I mean the news media is a very wide spectrum, and the reality is that the biggest circulating or biggest rating news media, print, electronic, online, etc., is the popular media. It's not what we're talking about here, the public interest journalism media, and it always will be, and politicians play to that audience. I mean, that's the reality. But I think, different parts of the media actually have different functions. In some ways they have the same function, but then it divides up.
Yes, we should be under no illusions about when information is put into the public sphere, which day, what time, to which audience, on which device, on which channel. That's all predetermined. It is getting harder. There are more barriers. There are more spin doctors. We're trying at the age to actually say just no to anything until we understand it a bit better, but that's also somewhat problematic if things get into the public domain that demand an analytical approach, and it's not always that easy. If you think about it, sometimes it does feel like you're just running and smashing into a brick wall. Nobody will talk to you, everybody goes to ground, we put out a press release, we're not talking. This is very common.
Can I get on to one of my favourite topics, News Limited? There's dispute as to whether News Limited, in terms of newspapers, owns 65 or 70% of the statewide and national press. But in the Finkelstein inquiry report, they did a systematic study of this, and they came to the conclusion that nowhere in the developed or Western world is there any country with one company owning such a large proportion of newspapers and the online part of, presence of newspapers. So my question is a very simple one. I don't know how you'll answer it. Has two prongs. One is, do you think it matters that we have allowed that situation to develop? And secondly, allied to that, what role do newspapers, do you think, play in influencing new media, but also radio and television, and as it were, the ancillary effects of their opinion-forming capacity through other branches of media? So, Paul, can I ask you?
First of all, so does it matter that News Limited owns so much? And
yeah, and secondly, what effects
newsroom?
Newspapers can have on the sort of political perceptions of a society, because not only their readership, but the way in which it, as it were,
Look, I think in fairness, first on the News Limited one, Fairfax is a pretty big player too. And so in fairness, what I would say is what ultimately has become a duopoly is unhealthy. I think the broader the voices, the better, healthier, kind of different views, different approaches to journalism, particularly when it comes to editors and newspapers kind of campaigning on issues and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the narrowing over time, over decades, has been unhealthy for Australia. We're only a small country, so if we have control in too few hands, I think it always raises eyebrows. So in fairness, I'd put Fairfax in there as well, because we own a lot of papers, a lot of reach, a lot of kind of control and influence. If I was to answer more specifically on news, the question is the makeup of their group is really interesting. A lot of tabloids, a lot of kind of mainstream mass media tabloids, and then the Australian, which is used to do something else. And I think it's in and around that, the kind of it's trying to understand what the corporate strategy with is in news with their products. And I think, and there's been a lot of public discourse about this, so it's for others really, rather than me, to continue that debate. I have said a few things. On the broader issue, I notice, when I go to the ABC or I'm on radio or whatever else, and as a consequence, I'm maybe listening in on that radio station right through the morning, I'm amazed, dumbfounded, sometimes angry with the lack of attribution about how many stories are really just out of the papers that morning. It's just like, because that's what there is, We're talking of a newsroom of 300 with me, and I don't know what ABC Radio Melbourne has, but it looks like 20 to 25, maybe 30, right? So where are they going to get their stories from? Imagine a world without the Australian, the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, just to start with. Those newsrooms don't exist. Who's going to get the story? Where do the stories come from? Who's going to have time to do them? How will they be caught in the kind of rush of press releases and spin? You do need resources. You do need, you know, real focus here. If you haven't got the newsrooms putting it out, and don't forget, putting it out, it's not what you're being told is the news, it's the other questions you need to ask. It's one of the things I like about journalism. It's not what we're being told, it's what aren't we being told. What did they just announce? What didn't they announce? Who said that? What are their motivations? If people aren't asking these questions, they're fairly basic, but if somebody's not doing it and providing it, not only will you have narrow ownership, but you'll have a narrow debate of an echo chamber of nothingness. Everybody kind of, and this is the risk of the new world, is everybody just kind of logging on to what they want to hear and what they want to be told, not wanting to be challenged. An echo chamber of nothingness. If you don't have the big newsrooms, there's a bit of a worldwide risk in this.
So just to put it in reverse, I don't think there's any doubt that the print media and big newspapers set the news agenda for the rest of the media for the reason that Paul said. They have vastly more resources. So that's been the case for decades and remains the case, and that's just a fact. On the News Limited, Rob and I have had lots of discussions about this over the years, and I've kind of, there's no question it's bad. I mean, Paul summarised it and he included Fairfax and whether you do or you don't. The idea that virtually all the daily metro newspapers except one in Perth are owned by two companies in this country and national newspapers is not a healthy thing for democracy. You know, you can hand-wring about that till you're blue in the face, and Rob often does, actually.
Go blue in the face, yeah.
But the question is, what can you do about it? It has the horse is well and truly bolted, and in fact, because of all the changes to the media landscape, technology, business models, etc., I think it's unlikely anyone's going to do anything about it. But to me, the question is, well, who's responsible? I don't actually think Rupert Murdoch's responsible. He's playing his role. He's playing the role of the person that works within the law. He doesn't break the law. He certainly helps frame the laws, but that's part of his role as well. I think it's politicians and governments who are just cowed by him, as we've discovered in the UK. We all knew it, but it's now public. And the same in Australia. Blame the politicians. They've allowed this to happen. It's a public policy failure.
We're just a few days past the publication of the Finkelstein inquiry, and just to summarise for those who haven't been following, the inquiry suggests a general new media council, or whatever they want to call it, funded not by media itself but supported by government but independent of government, which looks at newspapers, other forms of media and online publications, and really vamps up the possibility for citizens or groups to have complaints about what the media has done looked at quickly, and the capacity to publish apologies and so on with much more rapidity. I'm extremely interested, both from the point of view of the Age and the view of Crikey, as to how you've responded and what you think about the suggestions of Finkelstein.
For the Age, and we ran an editorial this morning on this, we see three major issues. One is whether or not it's right to have an all-encompassing body, because they're talking about newspapers, television, new media, internet, all in one, is one issue. The second is the manner in which that body is funded. And the third one is its powers. If I go to the first one, we wrote this morning and we have an open mind on the notion of a new body. And by the way, that's a distinctive voice in newspapers just at the moment. I think on all 3 points there has been a universal opposition to it. The Age has taken a slightly different view.
Even from Sydney Morning Herald?
Yes, indeed. Our view is that that the nature of change in the media industry, newspapers are not just newspapers now. We're newspapers, TV, radio, online, iPad, etc. Eric's businesses are not just online, they do other things as well, you know. So what started as an atomization of media, as mass media atomized with the internet, has now kind of created a reconvergence as new models of media are formed. Television stations, Channel 7, it runs its own website, you know, it kind of tweets, it does all of this stuff. So in some measure, the Age is very open to a discussion about an all-encompassing body. Where we're troubled is on the next 2 points. Our historical perspective on government funding, no matter what the indirect methods of funding, raises our concerns about control. We've seen governments of different political persuasions force change in media. What would stop them doing this again? Governments and media often clash. It's often a huge clash of ideology. That concerns me. And the last one is, over recent decades, the media has had to grapple with a myriad of new bodies that sit in judgment on what we do. So it used to be, you know, your defamation writs and your lawyers and off to court and kind of mediations, but there are so many others now. If I just to mention, you know, VCAT and maybe the Victorian Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission as a couple, I get a lot more of those sorts of things coming along. So I already have an explosion of judicial and quasi-judicial mechanisms that I must adhere to. I've already got a press council. Any attempt to introduce kind of fixed semi-judicial or judicial processes in addition to all of that, I'm quite troubled about in terms of kind of the ability to do our job well and not to spend all of our time responding in what can be, from my experience, cases that shouldn't have started.
Well, I take a slightly different point of view. I said this to the inquiry. I think that media, particularly bigger media, needs to understand how much they're on the nose, how much people distrust them, how low their reputation is, how little people think of most journalism, not all journalism, but they lump it all together. And if I was in that position and also confronting the avalanche on the business model and all of the other fronts that are attacking me, and the fact that the barriers to entry have collapsed so other people can come in, I'd be saying we need to address this, and we need to address it in a serious way. The Press Council does not do that. It is tame. We all know that. You know, they'll do an inquiry, some tame private inquiry, and the results will be published on page 47 6 months later. No one will ever read it. And so I would be saying, let's get on the front foot here. I think there is a conflict of interest when the newspaper publishers fund their own regulation, and that has happened in the past. News Limited have disagreed with the Press Council and they've withdrawn their funding. So unless they're prepared to put the money in the bank for 25 years and then replenish it every decade, and that would be one way of doing it, by the way, I think government funding is probably the only source. And I think I'd be going to the government and I'd be saying, we have to have this separation. We can't have any government interference. Let's sit down and work out whether we can get a mechanism between us, because it's so important that the public have the right of reply, the complaints mechanism, the immediacy of reply, because the internet exists to do that, and that we're seen to be preserving trying to preserve our reputation, rather than seen to be just sitting there, as the newspaper companies are now, saying, we know everything, we'll regulate ourselves, piss off.
Well, can I say thanks very much, Mary, for joining the panel. It's nice to have a colleague with me on these occasions. But also thank you very much to Paul Ramadge and Eric Beecher on what I think has been a remarkably sophisticated and enlightening and generous occasion. I've learned a great deal, and I think the students and others here will also have learned a great deal about the reality and the hopes for newspapers and quality journalism in the future. So I'd like to thank you very much. And